and others who said similar things. But one thing I do want to caution, and this I think is important too, is another Native scholar, I think she's Ojibwe, Renee Linklater, she said, not all people will be equally traumatized by the same circumstances. Therefore, some Indigenous people will experience a high degree of traumatic response, while others may experience little, if any, at all. So that's not to say everybody's going to react in the same way or the same way that I did. But I feel like when I tell my story, people will pull from that what they need to help them with their own stories and to help them with their own process. And sometimes, it's not easy to share or you're unable to share. So those of us that are able to can, and those who need to hear it can pull what they need from that story and find their own sources of healing and deal with their own trauma. But you have to take really, a lot of care with this because it is a space where it can be traumatic and there are lasting repercussions. I took a course, Generational Healing, where I did that. And there are still things that I'm dealing with from that today. So part of that, I think, is having resources for students to reach out to when they're going through that journey, because it can be a difficult one. So one thing then, again, I knew that I needed to do was deal with this trauma. And I had an understanding of generational trauma. I knew what historical trauma was. I knew that I had experienced things in my life that were very difficult, but I really didn't connect them to how they manifested in my life or how they influenced the way that I did things today. And in order to be a fully effective support system for other Native people, I had to take care of myself first. So I began that journey where I looked back through this course at trauma and how it was expressed in my family. So I knew some things about myself. Well, one was that I was always an extremely shy person, very quiet. The other thing was that I had trouble ever asking for help. I never asked for help. One thing that I could do was I could help others, but asking for help for myself was a very difficult thing. The other thing I knew about myself that I could never understand was I had a very contradictory nature. So on the one hand, I could sometimes do things that were surprising. So I could accomplish things, I could do well academically, but on the other side, there was a piece of me that always seemed to undercut them. So I would self-sabotage and do things that I didn't understand. And I would wonder later, why did I do that? This helped me to understand that. And then I think the bigger piece that did impact my teaching or my perception was I had a lot of anger over these things that I didn't know where it came from, and it did color my perception. So how can I be effective unless I examine these things? CMN has created an integrated studies program, a bachelor degree program, and I did write some curriculum and create a class that was designed to assist students in doing this in the same way that my generational healing class did. So it is something you could put into the curriculum as a class, but I also think it's a piece you could weave into other things as well, as long as you do it in a safe and self-caring manner. But I have a picture here, and this is my mother again on the bottom right with her brother, and then her aunt who raised her is in the top right, and then her grandmother is next to her. So I need to tell you a little about my mother's story so you can actually see how this sort of unfolded for me. But my mother was born into a damaged family. So it was a family really suffering from alcoholism, and that in turn meant that my mother was neglected. So her aunt came and raised her, or came and sort of rescued her from this family. She said she took her from the middle of the bed, uncared for, in a soiled diaper, and she took her home and they raised her. They didn't adopt her, they just took her and kept her. And she was taken from the reservation to a border reservation area, and her uncle was non-native, so they were raised there. But my mother's aunt suffered from alcoholism, and she would go on 2 to 3 week drinking binges. And when my mother was old enough, probably around 8 years old, she would have to stay home and take care of her siblings. Prior to that, her mother would actually take the kids along. And so my mother had to experience some pretty damaging incidents where she was left alone to care for infants at 8 years old, or they were left at home with no electricity in the dark. And then also she was exposed to predatory behavior by some of the men that were there. And then when she was old enough, 8, she was left home to take care of her siblings while her mother left. So she would miss 2 to 3 weeks of school at a time. And then while this was going on, she was also mistreated by her aunt, who would drink and then sometimes tell my mother, she would call her below bastard over her parents not being married. Or if she was mad at her, she would say things like, you're just jealous because you're not a real part of this family. And then when my mother went to school, things didn't get better for her. It wasn't a reprieve because she was the only Native school in this border town school. It was K-8, I believe. And she didn't tell me this until just a year or two ago. She had kept this to herself that whole time. And as a side note, we do know that Native people tend to keep their trauma to themselves. So it's something we carry within us. We don't share, we don't get support and help for often, and it's expressed in other ways. So my mother would go to school, and she said every day, particularly the boys, picked on her. She was called squaw, she was hit with elbows, she was pushed into lockers. This was her experience for 8 years of schooling. And she told me, well, one day, she said in 8th grade, things got better. And I said, well, Mom, did they quit doing that? And she said, well, no, they just started to bus in other Native kids, and then I wasn't alone. So this was my mother's upbringing. And she told me later that she felt continual rejection throughout her life. And that part of the response to that rejection was she could never express her feelings. So I remember growing up, we never said I love you to one another. Never. I never remember us saying that. We never hugged one another. We never had any expressions. I didn't even know that wasn't normal. It's a cycle that was broken because I show affection to my family. That's something that we do quite regularly. But I could have very likely just as well continued that behavior. But now I understand where that came from. As somebody who felt rejected their whole life, she was unable, it was a matter of self-preservation. She couldn't make herself vulnerable in that way to express it that way. What she did instead was she did things for people. She did everything for other people and nothing for herself. Much in the same way that I see myself today doing things, and much in the same way I see those very same things expressed by my daughters. We had no understanding where that came from. It also helped show me how I have this contradictory nature, or how I had it. I was fighting against myself and everything that had been told me about who I was. So even though I could accomplish something, that other side of me would come forward and sort of break it all apart. And until only in my 50s that I really looked at things, could I really see where they originated, and could I take measures to change them? And then I also had to recognize that I had a lot of anger in myself. I was very angry about the things I had had to endure, and that expressed itself in different ways. So one example for that was I would read work by Native scholars, and sometimes I would find myself looking up the credentials of these individuals. And it would upset me if I found out that this person had no connection with their Native identity, but came back to it later and now they're writing about it. And for some reason, it made me angry. And I thought, well, here I am doing the work of the colonizer. I can see that for what it is now, rather than recognize that this person had a right to that connection. And it isn't a choice that we make if we don't have that. And I think part of my feeling too was they didn't have to suffer for who they are. I saw myself as being raised and growing up and having suffered all of these things because of my identity. Sometimes because I was Native from non-natives. Sometimes I would catch it from natives because I didn't look Native enough. So it was a difficult thing for me to come to terms with. And some of these things I didn't want to admit, but it was something that I needed to do. And it has helped me tremendously. So it's sort of a long journey and road that I'm taking to become that support system for my students that I want to be. So in addition to that, another thing to consider is, how are we integrating culture, and are we doing it in a way that allows students to critically examine those policies, structures, and institutions around them? Gregory Courte says, this is why learning about the nature of colonization is such a foundational step in the pedagogy of Indigenous community-based education. Not only have Indigenous communities been significantly impacted by colonization historically, but they also face ongoing negative consequences today, though in less visible or blatant ways than in the past. So we all need to understand that these things do take root. And he talks about a new normal, so that we've suffered these soul wounds throughout our lives and throughout our history, and they become almost a new normal, he talks about, where we sort of absorb them into our culture. And we need to learn how to identify those things. The other part of it is learning to recognize these Western systems and how they have sort of insinuated themselves into our life so we don't even recognize them. So as I said, I went through the UW system. That's where I have all my higher education, in addition to starting out at my tribal college at LCO. But when I went through the teacher education program, UW's program was one of the top in the nation. And my feeling was, as long as I did well in this and came out and did the things they taught me, I would be a good teacher. And I did that. I got good grades in college. I came out, I employed the things that I'd learned in my courses, and I did pretty well in that respect. But during the course of my education, I had not been taught anything about learning to look at things from an Indigenous perspective or indigenizing my curriculum. So everything that was in place, I left in place and didn't question. I didn't look at the policies and systems. I, in fact, really disliked anything associated with administration. So I pushed that to the side. When, as faculty members, we were discussing policy, I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to be in the classroom. I wanted to be supportive to my students, and I wanted to assist them and help them on their journey to success. So I wasn't so concerned with that, and I didn't look at that as at all, really, honestly. But a couple of years ago, my son graduated from UW Wisconsin with a degree in linguistics, and he's a fluent Menominee speaker. And I remember the day sitting, watching him graduate and feeling all the pride a mother feels. And I was thinking, this is who we need at our college. And my son dislikes those Western college structures and systems. He hated every moment he was at UW, and just really did that because he knew that it would support him and help him to get where he needed to be for the career that he chose with the language. So here I was thinking, gosh, we really could use somebody like that at our college. But it hit me that he would never come and work at our college. And not because it's a bad place. We have worked stringently in these last 2 years to really look at a lot of the things that I've been talking about today. But as an example, we had a rank and promotion policy in place that required individuals to essentially promote themselves to advance. You had to apply for it. You had to bring all this evidence behind about why you should receive this movement upward with rank and promotion. And I thought, even if my son came to work there, he would never, ever engage in that process, because our value system doesn't support that. For their whole lives, my kid's father and I have always taught them over and over, you don't need to brag about yourself. You don't need to promote yourself. Your actions will speak for you. It's not about you. You're working for your community. Yet we're coming into our own structures sometimes where advancement requires that you do those very things. So why do we have those sort of policies in place? I recall once working with a student on a scholarship essay in one of my courses, and he said, I'm just really struggling with this. I can't do it. I have to talk about myself. I have to brag about myself. That feels weird. It doesn't feel right. No, because we teach our children that that's not right. Yet there's two pieces to that. On the one hand, there are certain things we know we have to say, well, this is what you need to do to advance. On the other side of that is, let's change these structures so that they reflect our values and identities rather than having us change to suit those, when we can, understanding that we have certain requirements in place for funding, for accreditation, where we have to sort of bend to those things. But when they can change, we really should work at changing them. So I think those are some of the things that we really need to address that we haven't. And like I said earlier, I went through 23 years of a career, so many years of education, and I never stopped to look at those structures. I really admire what the Lumina Foundation has done. They offer, I think it's a fellowship for Indigenous scholars. And they have a caveat in there where they don't have to apply for themselves, where somebody else can come in and apply for them, which I think is more the type of thing that we need in our own institutions. The other thing is, I think one thing that could be helpful in those areas where students are reluctant to step up because they don't want to be front and center, they don't want all the attention on them, and they don't want to make it about they want to make it about we, is we can use the Indigenous leadership perspective. I know a lot of our business courses and our instruction on leadership is centered around Western structures, but in Indigenous way, we know that our own stories tell us, and I'm thinking of the loon and the crane story here, where they tell us leadership isn't something you seek. Leadership is a responsibility that you take up, and that you go in and you do what you need to do, and then you step back. Those are ways that we can approach leadership, where our students can say, yes, maybe this is uncomfortable for me, but I know this is a responsibility I have to my community to help us nation build and to help support my people. And then when I'm done, I can step back. So these are the kind of considerations that I want to provide you with, that maybe you're already thinking about yourselves. But I know that as I'm looking and doing research and digging into this, I will often see people say, you know, the way to health and well-being is through our culture. And yes, that is absolutely true. But what if that individual doesn't understand their culture so that they can value it? What if they have disconnection and they don't have that safe space to reconnect? We need to provide those things for them, because we're not going to get where we need to be unless we do that. You know, how can we change our structures and systems in a way that promotes Native student and Native success in general? So I'm looking at those sort of things. And right now, like I said, there are considerations more than they are any kind of prescriptive ideas about what to do. But as you're planning curriculum or as you're working with Native students, I think these are some interesting questions, because the research and literature out there doesn't say a whole lot about that. And just to end here, I did provide some resources of the scholars that I've referenced. These are just a few. There are many, many more. But Gregory Courte has been a real inspiration for me. He's a brilliant man. He has a lot of different publications out there beyond this one. This is the first thing I happened to read that's really influenced me. Eduardo Duran, as I mentioned, and his discussion of the soul wound provided a whole new perspective for me. Renee Linklater talks a lot about how to deal with trauma and decolonizing trauma. That, I think, has been transformative for me. The novel, I know this is a fictional novel, but I think it's a wonderful tool to use to stimulate a discussion about identity. And then, of course, Sean Wilson, who wrote Research as Ceremony, and talks a lot about how we can indigenize the notion of research and incorporate Indigenous thought and practices. So I think I've covered everything. There could be things that I have left out because I can get off topic and go in many different ways. But I hope I provided to you something that could be useful as you're thinking about your curriculum and how to, you know, how do we indigenize our curriculum and what are the sort of values and ideas that we want to bring forward. So that is all I have. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Okay, so I see a question here on the topic of changing structures. How can we change our scholarship applications? We ask our students to complete a scholarship application, then evaluate that application to award funds. We use those applications to be able to tell the story of our students. So some of these things can't be changed. You know, if we are asking students to apply for scholarships where those things are already set out there, I think we can help them by having a frank discussion about what they're doing. So the student that I mentioned, one way that we were able to help him to move forward was to say, well, these are the requirements we have on the topic of this, for applying for this scholarship. But think ahead to what you want to do and the reason that you want this funding and what you want to do with your life. You know, in the end, you are going to use this money to get your education and to contribute to your nation and to help your people. So really, this isn't about you. You know, you're doing this ultimately to help your community. And then the other piece of it is as I said before about talking about Indigenous leadership, is to say, you know, this is a responsibility. So you're not doing this to break yourself up. You're accepting a responsibility you need to undertake to continue your education and then to do the things you have to do. So some of these things we can change, but we can change our thinking about them and how we approach them with students. So I hope that helps. Other questions? She might have said it, but definition of the term culture is clear. Do people have different perceptions of the word culture? Yeah, culture can be a whole other ball of wax in how people define it and perceive it. But I guess when I'm talking about culture, I'm talking about connecting with your traditions. I'm talking about connecting with your language. I'm talking about that, you know, I think that can be different for different people, but it's part of your identity and who you are as a Native person. So that's going to vary by your particular tribe and your experiences. But generally, I'm talking about that. And, you know, just like the idea that there's a lot of differences in what identity means and how we perceive what it means to be Native, I think that same thing can be associated to the word culture and what that means. So I don't know that I answered that question. So how do you think we can get this information out to more professionals and connect them to this information? So that's one of the things I worry about, is I think a lot of this information is going to will be out there in academia. I don't think it's something a lot of people are writing about, because in my research, I'm not finding a lot. I'm finding about a lot is said that we need to reconnect, we need to address these issues, but not a lot about on how to do that. And maybe I'm just not connecting with that or seeing it, but that seems to be one area in need. And that's what I intend to focus on. So my bigger concern is reaching those young people who need to hear this, because a lot of them don't. And that was my experience as a teacher, is they weren't really connecting with that or feeling that. They felt alone. They were either ashamed or afraid to speak about it. And for my mother's example, she didn't tell anyone about her school experiences until 2 years ago when she told me. And I asked her, Mom, why didn't you share that? And she said, well, I don't know for sure, but she said, I didn't want to make my mom and dad feel bad. And I know for myself, a lot of these things I didn't share because there was a certain amount of shame with them, or feelings and worries about being judged. So that's all a part of it. And so telling our stories, those of us who are able to tell our stories, I think that's one of the most powerful ways to get this information out there and make it accessible to those who need it most, those people who lack that connection. So, you know, I'm certainly not talking about everyone. There are a lot of people out there with very strong cultural connections. I'm really looking at those who need some support in reconnecting with that.
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I first of all, hi Vicki, it's nice to see you, and thank you for the
Hi.
presentation. Second of all, I agree with everything you just said, and I appreciate you sharing parts of your personal history with the group. Getting back to the curriculum, we have a first year experience in our one of the classes that we have freshmen take in their first semester. And part of it was helping them to address issues within themselves, going back and, you know, trying to instill lessons of personal accountability and responsibility, but then also helping them walk through like issues that they needed to address in order to be successful, not just student, but human being, you know? And so I guess recently we have revamped that class, and through student evaluations found that that was the part of the class that they really didn't appreciate having to do. And so I'm thinking, like, because we're like that question that the person asked you, and then like your work, and trying to figure out how can we help the most amount of people in a systematic way through education, like all the students coming through, let's help them in these ways, like, I guess. And then I'm hearing you say, like, just by living by example, right, and sharing our stories and telling those things and being welcoming and opening. I guess my question was like probably that answer, like how can we do it in a different way that is not intrusive and doesn't like put people on the spot and make them work through this exercise where they have to face things that maybe they're not ready to face at that point in their life. But I guess organically, like, how can we still have that part of our system of education where we're there and ready to help, not
Yeah,
not forcing in
I
a
think,
class.
yeah, for sure. You don't want to force anything on anyone or force them to share or do anything they're not comfortable with. And I think, like I said, story is a powerful way to do that when those who are able to can share and without expectations of anyone reciprocating. So when I would talk to my students, I initially didn't do this with anything in mind other than to just share my experience with them to demonstrate things. And I did sort of suspect that other students felt the same way, but it was something I never talked about. So it was kind of dealt with in isolation. And so I wanted them to know that I wasn't putting anything on them that I wasn't willing to share. And I never asked anyone to share. I never asked that if they wanted to, they were able to. So I think even if they don't speak, they're going to pull something from it. So, you know, when I started asking these questions, sometimes it would lead to the most profound conversations. And that really is what motivated me. I remember one day we were having a discussion and I asked, I don't know, I didn't even know how it came about, but I told them about the fact that in my family, we never expressed affection. And I just had never talked to anyone about that before. And I just thought it was something unique to my family. And then strangely, other students started saying, that's exactly what it was like in my family. That was what it was like in my family. And we ended up having a really deep conversation on where do you think that came from? And we really did recognize that we each had people in our family that suffered trauma, and that as a response to that trauma and to self-protect, that was one way that they could do it. They loved these people, but they couldn't express it for those reasons. Others who didn't want to share certainly didn't have to. And what I did was, um, you know, we'd have that first day conversation about how do we define what it means to be Indian, or how have others prescribed that meaning to us. Then I read him a story from Native testimony called What Am I?, which is about a young Native person struggling with identity. And then they just wrote a reading response where they could personally explore it without anyone else seeing it, and I could respond individually. But I think having somebody be able to share without expectation that you're trying to force them to do that introspection is at least a start where they can start recognizing these things or thinking about them. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you,
um,
Vicki.
oh,
I do have, there's two Facebook questions, or one question, one comment. It says, I can relate to what you are saying. Native communities sometimes question my nativeness, and the white community treat me different when they learn I am Native. That was from Kathy Baker. And a question, do people have different perceptions of the world of culture?
different perceptions of the role of culture.
The word culture.
The word culture. I'm sure they do. I mean, I just generally sort of define it as those practices and beliefs that make you who you are. There are a lot of different ways to look at culture and ways to define it. So when I use it in this presentation, I'm really thinking about the traditions and practices that make us who we are as Native people. You know, our language, our ways of being, our ways of knowing. I sort of bring those all in as culture.
Thank you, Vicki. Do you have any advice for helping younger children in education that have these soul wounds, and you can see it having an effect in their work, participation, and behaviors?
This is less an area that I have expertise with, but I know just from my own role as a mother to 5 children that one of the best things I have done is just being able to have honest conversations with them about these things. But children who have wounds, obviously the things I'm talking about here, you can apply to very young children. But I think one really important thing is always stressing that principle of ownership, that this is yours and you have every right to it. That this is who you are. We have to combat those outside voices because if we don't have a cultural foundation, there are going to be plenty of people who are going to come and fill that void largely with negativity. I mean, that was my case. You know, I absolutely don't blame my mother for not giving me that because she didn't have that to give to me. She had that taken from her. It wasn't a choice. So I didn't have it. But what I did have were these negative voices who were more than willing to come in and tell me who I was. So I think at a young age, we have to keep instilling that in our children, that who they are is beautiful and that they have every right to that, to pursue it in whatever way they want. And I think there can be a danger of sounding prescriptive because it can seem like we're telling people this is the way you need to be Native and the way you are isn't the right way. Even though I know we would never intend that, I think that's how it can be perceived of how dare you, you know, tell me I need to learn my language. I'm already Native, you know, that kind of response to it. So we have to be careful in how we approach that, but certainly just underscore that idea that, you know, this is your culture. It's beautiful. This is who you are. You have every right to that. And we have to do it throughout every opportunity we can throughout their education.
Thank you, Vicki. In closing, there are 2 comments, one by Andre Bowley. Inspiring, truthful, powerful, humble. I've already shared this link with my daughter and colleague. Can't wait to rewatch. Lene Begay, I found that the talking circle process helped bridge understanding, expanded educational knowledge and experience.
Yes, the talking circle is an excellent resource to use that where you're doing it in a safe, supportive space. So thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Oh, there's one more. Vicki is great and so amazing with everything she does for culture and education.
That's probably a friend.
Thank you for centering identity and at a tribal college.
Well, thank you. I always worry I'm not going to say everything I want to say, but I hope I captured, you know.
Thank you, Vicki. Thank you for your time today. In the chat box, you will see a link to a survey. Please complete this evaluation. As a reminder, the series will take place throughout the month of October in a virtual format focusing on 4 key issues: education, economic and workforce development, health and environment. This series is hosted in collaboration by Ojibwe College, College of Menominee Nation, and the University of Wisconsin System. The next session will be on the College of Menominee Nation Sustainable Development Institute on Wednesday, October 28th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you.
Nice seeing